Hello and welcome to Ops and Hops, the podcast for those who like beer but have to work in tech to afford it. Today I've got Jenn Bergstrom, the Cloud and Data Solutions Lead at Parsons. Hey Jenn, welcome to the show.
Hey Derek, I'm glad to be here. How you doing?
Doing pretty well. What did you bring to drink today? I know you're still at work, so probably nothing too strong, I hope.
Yeah, I am still at work, so unfortunately nothing alcoholic, but I have my lovely purple drink. It's actually, I know, it actually has caffeine, but it's mostly water, so it makes me feel virtuous while I'm still getting my caffeine high.
Oh, so you're still doing drugs. That's fine.
Something like that, yeah.
Well,
Just a legal drug.
of course. In solidarity, I've decided to jump on, and I mean, it is January. You might as well have. I'm having kind of a damp January, I'll be honest. And I've got a non-alcoholic brew called Wellbeing Intentional IPA. About to find out exactly how it tastes. Honestly, looks kind of like a Bud Light, but we'll see. I've had better, but I've had worse. So I think I'll still make it through the show.
That was
Got a little bit of a
bitter beer face.
A little bit of a chemical taste going on there. Might be the alcohol removal process, but
Not
hey,
expired.
it's better
is it?
than nothing.
Yeah.
So anyway, Jenn, I know you have had quite the ride. We've been discussing, we've been talking for years since COVID. You're one of the original virtual happy hour members that we did on my Discord back in the day in 2020 when virtual was all anybody had. And I know you've been moving up the ranks at Parsons since then. You've done a lot. You are in a hiring position. You are in a management position. Can you tell us, and I don't know how long your journey has been. You don't have to go all the way back to your high school job, but can you give us a little idea of your journey and kind of what allowed you to pivot to get to such a great position?
Yeah, absolutely. So I will go back to college, but only very briefly to say that my undergrad is actually in electrical engineering, and my senior project was a pure hardware project, which I fundamentally despised, even though I got through it. So I promptly pivoted into software. And I worked in software for about 10 years for a little company called Lockheed Martin. You may or may not have heard of it. And then actually stepped entirely out of the tech industry for 7 years about to be home with my kids full time. So, I know there's been a lot of conversations that I've seen recently about, is it advisable to take a gap in your career? And a lot of people say, don't do that. You can do that, and it still works out okay. Came back into the industry the day my youngest started first grade. I dropped her off at school and drove into the office for my first day back in the office. So, nice transition day for both of us. The company that I hired on with at the time was called Solidyne Solutions. I think I was employee number 72 or somewhere thereabouts. And I was hired in to do software engineering, so writing Java code for enterprise scale systems. And then that company eventually was bought by another company, which was 3 times the size, more than 3 times the size, 10 times the size of Solidyne when they bought us. And then 6 months after that company bought us, that company was bought by Parsons, where I currently work. So, and Parsons, for the record, is about 17,000 employees. So I went from 100 employees to 2,300 employees to 17,000 employees in the space of about 6 months, which was a little bit crazy. While I was at Solidyne, I started pivoting a little bit out of pure software and into cloud. AWS was my first cloud. It's not my only cloud, but it's the one that I dove into first. And since then, have progressed here at Parsons. I haven't had to leave the company to have a pretty fun career path. I've had roles as project management. I've had roles as portfolio manager with a suite of about $50 million in products under my teams. And then progressed into a sector CTO where I was managing all the technology strategy for an organization of about 2,200 people. And then now I'm in my current role, Cloud and Data Solutions Lead for one of the markets in our company. And that market has about 4,500 employees. So I'm managing our multi-cloud strategy for 4,500 employees and all of our customers across that space.
Wow. Yeah, that's quite the journey. Still a little nervous about Solidyne Solutions and how close it sounds to Cyberdyne. Not sure if we're going to be battling anything that you build anytime soon, but hopefully not.
I would hope not. We didn't do too much with AI, so
Yeah,
if you're
yeah.
battling it, you're battling it with a human at the helm, so.
Well, it might even be scarier. So
Possibly.
you've done a lot, and in your current position now, do you do any individual contributor work? Do you do any code? Do you touch anything, or are you pretty much just a someone people reach out to? Do you help? I know you do keep up to date. I know you do know everything that you need to know for this stuff, but how much do you actually deploy? Is it anything, or?
Not much, honestly.
Yeah.
I tend to provide an advisory capacity for programs. So, if a program is struggling or a project is struggling with a certain capability in my domain space, they might call me in, excuse me, and I might get a hand or two, on code for a couple days while I'm supporting them. But the reality is most of the work that I'm doing is more on the strategic level now. So planning out how we're going to work with our partners, how we're going to, work with the cloud providers in an intelligent way, and then making sure that our teams know what they need to know to be able to implement the guidelines that I provide intelligently and correctly.
So how do you stay up to date, especially considering you don't have that daily, drive? You don't have that daily task. You don't have that gyro board that says, hey, you need to learn this right now or you're never going to get this done. Now it's kind of, I imagine as in a managerial position, you could probably mask things you don't know, but you, above a lot of managers that I've met, you do seem to stay on top of it. So where do you get that motivation from to stay on top of the newest trends?
Well, I will say that I have an insatiable curiosity, and I always have. I also benefit from being ADHD, which I know not everybody says that's a benefit. However, I found it to be a benefit because my brain likes to be thinking about 15 different things all at once all the time. And so, I can be thinking high-level strategy with part of my brain, and at the same time, I'm writing myself my own little driver, to create an Alexa app or something along those lines, or building a Party Rock app in AWS, or, So having a slightly frenetic, slightly split brain like I do actually helps me out with staying current. The other thing is I've put a lot of energy and effort into creating a habit of continual learning. So every morning, part of my morning routine is about a half an hour of diving deep into something. And typically now that I'm in more of a leadership role, I try to focus that something on the in or hands-on technical work, which probably sounds a little counterintuitive, but because I'm doing less of that on the job, I want to focus on it in my own individual development that I'm doing. So every morning I spend about a half an hour doing something technical, hands-on related.
So I imagine that helps then, if somebody comes to you and proposes a solution, you do typically need the ability to catch whether that's a BS solution or there's a problem there. I mean, do you find a lot of times where things just kind of flow in a way that probably are the right way, or do you find that sometimes somebody brings you a solution and you're like, wow, I totally never thought of that, I need to go study it? Or is it more like, actually that's very close to what I've been studying here recently, that sounds pretty great? How do you find that balances? Do you get surprised often?
I get surprised on occasion. I wouldn't say
Yeah.
it's often. I do a pretty good job of keeping a high-level understanding of what the trends are and where things are going. So typically, it's not completely out of left field. It's something that I've at least kind of seen, gotten an idea of. There have been a few times when people came in with recommendations or suggestions where I just hadn't been thinking along those lines at all. And usually it's not that I didn't have the knowledge, it's more that I wasn't making the connection that they were making. And so, typically questioning, talking with them a little bit, diving into where their thought process took them and why it took them that way gets me to where I understand what they're talking about.
Do you feel a lot of pressure being in a management position to always be ready for someone trying, a new employee or somebody who just thinks they're, and obviously you may not be able to answer this because somebody might listen to it, but maybe in the past you may have had somebody who tried to get you on your toes, tried to look smart, tried to say, actually, you're just the manager who doesn't know much. Do you ever find any pressure from that? Sorry, I'm trying to word it just right, but I think you get where I'm going.
Yeah, no, I think I get where you're going. And I will say, honestly, I see that less now as a manager in a lead SME type of position than I did as an individual contributor, hands-on technical person. And I think probably the reason is because I'm much more visible within my organization now, so people know that if they have a cloud or data question, they come to Jenn.
Okay.
And, that's kind of accepted at this point. I've proven that capability. People know that I know what I'm talking about. So I don't have to prove myself anymore. But when I was down in the weeds doing the technical work, I think some of the unintentional bias that our community still tends to have against women in tech came out. And I had to foot stomp a little harder that I really do know what I'm talking about, when I was meeting new people in the technical staff.
Right. No, I still see it very unfortunately all the time. There's just so many biases out there and people that just feel threatened immediately, by someone just different than them. Obviously, women for one, but any minority, anybody different than them, they just all of a sudden feel threatened, and it's such a shame to see that happening so much. Any tips for those other women ICs out there that might encounter that type of behavior? I know that, it's always a touchy subject. You can't just run to the manager. You can't just do this, without somebody just making it worse. What is something you would recommend for somebody who's experiencing that type of behavior?
So one of the things that I've always tried to make a point to do, and I think it's benefited me in my career, this is a little bit of a tangent, but rather than directly challenging when somebody makes a bad assumption, I've always turned it around into I'm just going to speak in a way that makes it 100% clear that I know what I'm talking about. And then let that obvious knowledge change their perception. The exception to that, and this unfortunately has happened to me several times, not recently, but when I was earlier in my career, if you're at a trade show or a conference or something like that, and you're on the floor, as an example, I was demonstrating a system that we had built that was a Kubernetes, containerized system deployed across AWS and Azure to demonstrate extreme availability and reliability. I was the one doing the technical demo, and somebody approached me and said, "Hey, can you take me to the engineer to learn about this demo?" And sometimes when people make that kind of an assumption, you kind of have to foot stomp it immediately to just help them understand that that was a bad assumption. And I said, well, yeah, I'll take you to that person. And I basically walked them around the demo station and stopped and said, "Hey, nice to meet you." And they were like, "Wait, what?"
I love that so much.
So, a little bit cheeky, maybe a little bit less than perfectly professional, but that person actually is somebody I'm still in contact with today, and I think we share a mutual respect for each other because they realized, oops, they put their foot in it a little bit, and then we ended up having a really good conversation. So, my advice to women that are struggling in the industry, especially when you run into that type of bias, is two things really. Try not to take it personal because it usually is unconscious bias. And two, just understand that as you start talking and showing your expertise, you're going to prove them wrong and you're going to help change that bias. So then the next time they encounter a woman in the industry, they'll be slightly less biased against thinking that women can be in this position. So, foster your own self-confidence and really make sure that you know what you're doing and do whatever you need to do to give yourself that certainty. Having women peers that you meet with regularly or having a mentor that helps you with that or a coach can be really valuable. And then dwell in that confidence and let what you say and let your knowledge demonstrate for people that make the bad assumption that you deserve to be there and that you know what you're talking about.
That's great. Yeah. I mean, I know some guys are super unfortunate. They'll come out and be like, to a Python engineer and be like, well, I bet you couldn't do that in C or something stupid like that. And so I imagine there are some people you just can't change, but it's really good to know. I love hearing stories that sometimes people will actually come around and change because, sometimes your upbringing or whatever can be unfortunate. So,
Yeah, that is true.
yeah, that's awesome. Really glad to hear you help bring somebody to the right side anyway. So, how do you feel? And I know you highly value work from home life right now. How do you feel about, because are you hybrid or are you fully on site, or what is your exact working situation?
So my official working station is hybrid. I can be either on-site or work from home. Most typically, I come into the office pretty much every day, but that's by choice because I have two daughters who are in full-time schooling that's fully online. And then, of course, my useless zoo, as I like to call them, of critters, and my spouse, who are all home distracting me when I try to work from home. So, for my own sanity, for my ability to stay focused on work while I'm trying to do work, I tend to come into the office. But my entire team, everybody that I work with directly on a day-to-day basis, is not located in my office. So even when I come in and I'm here in, a Parsons facility, I'm still working remotely. And that's just kind of the way that our team is. Our team is scattered all across the United States. So, hybrid remote is the norm at Parsons. We try to make sure that anybody that wants to work either at their house or from an office can do what they want to do. And, that's one of the things that I really appreciate about my company and value highly with being here.
Do you have a lot of offsites, or do you bring people to the office often? Do you just use conferences? How does that work?
More conferences.
Okay.
Depends on the group, though. My group in particular, we do have a summit once a year where we all go to Virginia, where our company headquarters are, and get together in person so that we have that face time. There also is, at least in my role, a fair amount of travel. I probably average a week a month that I'm on travel for work, whether it's going to conferences or traveling to different locations to meet in person with people. So, we balance that out. We do a lot of team activities within our own local office as well. So even though I don't work directly with any of the folks here, I know them all. We all get along. It's a comfortable environment. So we still build that feeling of, of cooperation and of collaboration within our own office space, even as we are widely spread across the country.
Right. So another question, and again, I know that you work with a lot of very sensitive things, and there's only so much you can talk about. For a company as large as yours, how often, if ever, or if always, do you deal with multi-cloud? I know you are constantly talking about AWS, and just about every time we talk, usually everything is tempered with AWS. But do you play in the other clouds often? Do you find yourself hopping around?
Yeah, so Parsons is officially a multi-cloud company. We actually have partnerships with both AWS and Azure. Our customer space is a multi-cloud space. So, I'm actually knowledgeable in AWS, Azure, Google, and Oracle clouds, and use that knowledge regularly with my different customers in the space. So, multi-cloud is a reality for us. It's just something that we deal with day to day. So, a big part of what I do as the cloud and data lead, solutions lead, is make sure that people understand the trade-offs when they're deciding what their architecture needs to look like in the cloud. When does it make sense to use a multi-cloud architecture? When does it make sense to go cloud native in one cloud? When does it make sense to be hybrid or a blended environment? And I've actually made a series of posts on LinkedIn over the last several months kind of talking about that criteria and how you assess the system that you're building and determine what makes sense from an architectural perspective. So yeah, it's a very real part of the work that I do, and a regular thing that I'm doing is that trade-off.
What would you say, maybe one or two or three of the major considerations between multi-cloud or single cloud are? I know egress charges are obviously a big one, that type of thing. But what else would you look at to say, what, you are serious enough that you need to have multi-cloud, or this will absolutely destroy your infrastructure if you try it?
Yeah, so I would say I tend toward keeping things as simple as reasonably possible, which means that, cloud native in a single cloud or, cloud agnostic in a containerized application is typically where I would go first for most systems. There are some systems where, you know that you're going to have to be operating the system disconnected from all network for a while. So your design has to accommodate that, and that's especially, where the cloud or where containerization comes into play and building something that's truly agnostic. There are other situations where data throughput latency, you need things to be processed real time. And so latency then becomes a huge driver in where you're going to put things and how you're going to handle your data and your applications. Really, for multi-cloud, I tend to encourage away from it as much as possible, primarily because the data egress, of course, is a huge factor, and it can become very expensive very quickly, but also securing that environment. When you build a multi-cloud environment, you're just adding so many additional points of potential vulnerability into your system that if you don't have a very compelling reason why you need to be operating across cloud boundaries, don't do it.
Well, we got a sound bite there. Definitely using that one for a sound bite. So, yeah, and that all makes perfect sense. Now, when architecting these types of solutions, I've got to ask, obviously, being the Terraform guy, is it always Terraform? Is it case by case? Or is it up to the developers who have, chosen the environment? Kind of, how do you decide which IAC tool is going to be used for each environment?
Yeah, so, part of it depends on the knowledge of the existing team that's doing the implementation. If you have a team that is, hotshot team on AWS, like some of the folks that I work with, and they know CloudFormation really, really well, and Terraform would be a lift for them, then, maybe let them use CloudFormation if they know they're only going to be running in AWS. A lot of times, if there's no preference or if they're learning the skill for IAC in general, as part of the project, I'll point them toward Terraform just because it is so much more extensible and usable across more than just cloud deployments. And so it gives them a lot of flexibility that they wouldn't necessarily have by default. Other times, our customer dictates what they want us to use. If we're deploying, into a hybrid environment or a blended architecture where we're using some of their on-prem environment and some, cloud environment, we have to use what tools they provide in that case a lot of times. And so sometimes, that ends up being something like, and please forgive me for saying this, but Chef or Puppet or, those lovely options. And we'll work with what the customer expects us to work with in those cases.
Are you seeing much CDK adoption out there?
Not in my space too much. On our commercial side, there is some CDK usage, and honestly, I'd love to see more of it. But we don't see too much of it in the space I tend to operate within.
Do you have a reason why you prefer CDK in many cases? Is it just comfort with the language, or do you have other reasons like tooling or security or anything like that?
I think it's really just comfort with the language.
Okay.
If you're used to writing software, CDK is a pretty easy transition.
Do you find that software people are responsible for the infrastructure often, at least in your space? I know that it varies all over the place.
Yeah, fairly often. I would say they can be responsible for the infrastructure of the application that they're building. So
Okay.
maybe not the infrastructure, baseline that they're actually running on, not the platform itself, but then everything from there up oftentimes is within their bailiwick.
Do you or have you seen any infrastructure from code implementations? I know that it's getting there. I've seen several little platforms coming out, several frameworks coming out that are, basically if you write a queue, something that requires a queue in the code, it automatically deploys a queue without writing any infrastructure specific code. Have you seen that, experienced that, dream about it, anything like that?
I don't know if I would say dream about it or have nightmares about it, honestly. It could be either. No, I haven't seen that adoption yet within my industry.
Okay.
I expect it'll start sneaking in, just like, we've been seeing the the LLMs start sneaking in and, people start advertising that they build intelligence into their systems and really all they're doing is an API hit to ChatGPT or something like that. So I expect we'll start to see some of that trickle its way in, but it tends to be a little slow to get into where I tend to operate.
Yeah, I mean, with the LLMs and everything like that, part of me wonders, what the future of like infrastructure coding is. I mean, it's getting to the point where everything's just going to be natural language. You're going to say, hey, I need a queue that connects to this VPC, and I can already write passable Terraform code doing that. I will say, it always takes a solid once over to keep from doing something absolutely asinine. But, it's getting to the point where, I mean, do you think within the next 5 years or so, we'll see a lot of natural language infrastructure building?
That's a really good question, actually. The cynic in me says what we're probably going to see is rapid adoption for a little while, and then we're going to see a couple of things go spectacularly kaplooey because the person that used the LLM didn't understand how to check for quality before they deployed what it told them to do. And then after we've had a few things go kaplooey, I think it's going to slow down for a little while and people are going to put on the brakes. And then there's going to get to be some discipline around it. Basically, a methodology for validating the quality of the recommendations. The models themselves are going to get better at quality checking themselves. And, I think being optimistic, I'll say probably 5 years down the road, you'll see that being a very common thing, that they use a more intelligent, frameworked, disciplined approach with LLM to help do a lot of the writing. I do think it's going to be a roller coaster getting there.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking of kaplooey, what kind of do you do a lot of static code checking for your infrastructure code? Is this open policy agent? Do you use like built-in stuff within the clouds, AWS config, things like that? Do you have like a go-to framework or tool that you use to ensure that the code that's about to get deployed doesn't go kaplooey?
So we have several different tools that we make available within our development environments. It's another one of those where, we use Nessus, we use SonarQube, we even have some groups that still use Fortify. So there's a variety of tools that are in play, and a lot of it is driven by what our customer is comfortable seeing as evidence of the solidarity and the quality of our system. So we don't, unfortunately, get to use a lot of the cloud-native tooling that's out there, primarily because of the concern that our customers have with the cloud agnosticism, and designing our systems that way. So a lot of times we just really can't use those tools as much as I would like to.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And that certainly can limit your AI adoption, even though I'm sure SonarQube's probably already got several booth designs ready to go with about AI listed, 14 times and whatnot. But I imagine there'll probably be a toggle there to make sure that you don't have to use that unless you really, really, really want to. And I imagine in a sensitive environment like what you deal with, you probably hold back on the AI adoption.
Well, it really depends on how it's implemented. If it can be compartmentalized so that you're running the AI using a knowledge store that you control without, having to reach back into SonarQube itself, a lot of times that type of thing will be allowable. Obviously that has a different cost model and a slightly different performance model and a wildly different maintenance model than, running using the native as a service offerings that they provide. But we have been pretty successful at pulling some things in that are pretty cool technology using the compartmentalization tactic. So, I think we'll find, especially for companies like SonarQube that are used to working in my space, we'll find that they find ways to support that and making that available to those customers pretty quickly.
So do you encounter issues then with, foreign entities? Obviously, I don't know, I don't know if this data is stored in AWS or if it's on-prem or what, but I know, for instance, we can't ship certain equipment to China in some countries. I know NVIDIA can't just ship GPUs anywhere. they have to keep a lot of stuff within the confines of the U.S. and, maybe EU partners and stuff like that. But, I know there was just a huge thing about NVIDIA being just now allowed to sell China lower powered chips because we don't want to give them the ability to catch up with us technically. So do you encounter any of that? That you can speak to? Is there anything like that you've encountered?
Yeah, absolutely. Just from a personal basis, when I'm speaking at conferences, if I have slides that I'm putting together, those have to go through an export review before they're released and able to be used at the conference. So both from the physical systems that we build within my company and with the digital systems that we generate and the digital, everything that goes with that, data and applications and everything else, we have to be very concerned with any potential export regulations, any data sovereignty concerns, I always mess up the acronym, but the data protection policy that was passed in the EU that's pretty strong, that impacts us and that impacts the way that we operate. So, it's one of those things where every employee is provided basic training in how to handle the data properly, and then we have very strong data access policies in place to try to make it hard for people to mess up unintentionally.
Yeah, so Works on My Machine may not be a viable option when dealing, let's say, with a country in the Middle East or something like that. They may not have your machine or anything even close.
Right.
So, yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. Yeah, so let's see. Let's hop all the way back for just a second. Electrical engineering. You started there. You said you started with hardware. What was that pivot like going from there to software? I mean, I imagine you were dealing with I guess, C, maybe even lower than that.
Yeah, assembly and C were the languages I learned primarily in college. And that does age me a little bit, I know, but, whatever.
Assembly, maybe, but C is still very, very, very big in IoT, mostly C++, but IoT world, they need this real-time stuff for sure.
Yeah, so I will say, one of the things that was really cool about the school that I went to, which was Utah State University in Logan, Utah, not a very well-known school from an engineering perspective, but actually a phenomenal school for the breadth of education that they gave you. So as an electrical engineer, I did assembly language programming, 64-bit assembly language. I did, C coding. I did scripting, bash scripting, and, Linux administration and various other things like that are more traditionally considered IT or software-focused type of work. So making the switch into software, I actually found the EE background to be tremendously beneficial because I understood what was actually going on when I wrote a line of code in C++. What really was happening down at the assembly language and down at the bit level below that, and why does that make a difference? So there was a learning curve, of course, but realistically, there's always a learning curve when you're coming out of college or boot camp and going into a real enterprise level company, because the projects you do in college can't compare. They're just, you don't have enough time to make the big projects that you do in the real world. So,
right.
I don't think my learning curve was really any worse than the average CS graduates would have been. And in some ways, it was easier for me to do good coding practices because of the EE background.
I imagine a stack trace makes a lot more sense to you than a lot of people. It seems like once a stack trace happens, here comes ChatGPT, Stack Overflow, everything else. Stack Overflow, literally the name of it is Stack Overflow. Do you find that you, obviously not now, but, over the years, did you find that while some of your other coworkers were struggling to fix something or whatever, you were able to dive into that stack trace and say, oh, here it is right here, find it and make a quick correction where, to them, it was like, we got to Google this all day?
Yeah, I would say it probably was, and I also did my best to avoid having to do that as much as possible.
Well, of course.
It wasn't horribly difficult to do, but I didn't particularly enjoy doing it.
Right. Yeah, I could absolutely see that being a pain, for sure. So do you feel, everything's pretty sufficiently abstracted nowadays? I imagine do you ever dive into some IoT stuff? Are you ever hacking away at some hardware anymore? Do you jump into C or C++ at all?
No, I really don't anymore. C++ on occasion, because some of our programs do still use it, and so if they bring me in, to ask for help, sometimes I'll see some C++ code, but it's not really writing it, it's not diving into it. I'm really not using that as much now. I think if I had stayed more on the software engineering path rather than moving into cloud, I'd probably be using it a lot more than I am.
How do you feel the bottleneck has changed since, hardware now is so much faster? Do you think that other than like true real-time hardware, do you feel like there's a huge need for C++ and things, or do you think Python and JavaScript and, Go, of course, is faster than those, and then everybody's really jumping on Rust. But do you find that overall, those bottlenecks that you were solving with those are kind of gone now, or do you still think that they really help at scale?
I think there are some use cases that my company deals with where they still very much apply. Specifically, when we are building systems to go onto platforms that are being reused by our customer, the procurement process for those platforms can be decades long. And so you're oftentimes working with hardware that is, as a result, decades old. And, so memory concerns, operational capability concerns, RAM, storage, all of that very quickly do actually become a legitimate still concern. The other side of it where I see it playing a big role still is in low power applications. So anytime you have an application that's dealing with a system that has, heavy power draws that are already expected on it, so your allocation that you have available to you is minimal, you have to be very, very smart and efficient in the way that you write your system.
So based on your journey, if somebody wanted to, get where you are today or, follow their own path, maybe just become like a principal contributor or whatever, maybe not all the way up, but, principal's pretty high.
Yeah.
Where would you recommend they start nowadays? Would you recommend, this is a question I kind of throw at several people who've kind of been through the full trek. Would you recommend they start with what people are using most now, like the Python, and kind of start higher up the stack? Or would you recommend and then, back up if they need to? Or would you recommend that you just stick a certain amount of time at the bottom of the stack, maybe not assembly, but C, and work your way up from there? What is your personal opinion on that one?
So I'll give the classic engineer answer. It depends.
Right.
It really depends on what type of work they want to be doing. If they want to be doing primarily cloud focused, a lot of streaming, a lot of, highly variable workloads that scale all the time, and, that type of thing, honestly, going for the higher level languages that are used more often in building those systems makes more sense. But if they're looking at something like, working in the military sector where they're dealing with platforms, again, that can be decades old, it would make more sense for them to dive into the lower level. So I guess I would say I would probably recommend most people start with something like a Python, because it's kind of a nice bridge between the really abstracted layers that you can do and the C's and C++, and it gives you the familiarity with how programming languages in general work. But then as they get an idea of where they want to go and what type of work they want to do and what type of systems they want to work with, then they can adjust what they're learning. I mean, the reality is in tech, you're constantly learning anyway, right? So you can kind of pick your starting point and learn your way to where you need to be. You're going to be learning regardless.
Right. Yeah, no, that's fantastic information. So, well, Jenn, this has been awesome. Do you have anything else you want to cover? Anything else you want to let people know or remind people of, or any tips to anybody trying to get to where you are?
Yeah, so as far as tips to get to where I am, one of the things that I've seen in my career is that when I make a formal 5-year career path, like a lot of career coaches recommend that you do, I find that I'm never ambitious enough in the career path compared to where I actually end up going. So the recommendation that I give to people when I mentor them now is have an idea of the type of work that you want to do, but keep your eyes open for opportunities, especially ones that are really unexpected or that force you to learn a new domain space. In the work that I'm doing now, if you had asked me 3 years ago if I would want to be doing this work or if I could even conceive that I'd be in this type of a position, I would have said, how would I get there? But the path just happened, and it happened by me stepping into those opportunities and making it clear to my leads and to the people around me that I was interested in opportunities and in new challenges. So, you're never done. Your journey's never done. And even the most random tangents, as an example in my own career, and I typically leave it out in a description of where I go, but I did a stint here at Parsons as the office manager, meaning I was the one stocking the snack fund and the beer fridge, and I was accepting deliveries for packages and, yeah, totally, yeah, the beer fridge. This is not from our beer fridge. But totally outside of the realm of the work that I do day to day. But what I got from that was connections with our facilities staff, which I actually do use day to day. Having those relationships with those individuals helps me do my job now. So it was a tangent. It was kind of a weird little side route to take, but it's valuable, and I learned things that I use now and built relationships that I use now. So, don't think that a side path, even if it looks very different, is taking you away from where you want to go. It might actually be the best route to get there.
That's great. No, that's wonderful. So how would you like people to get in touch with you? If anybody has any more questions or anything like that, I know some people might, hide a little bit, but you seem to be pretty open and friendly as all hell. So how would you like people to reach out? You a LinkedIn person, you a Twitter person? What makes the most sense?
Yeah, so for me, LinkedIn makes the most sense. That is where I'm most active. The other place you can find me is Tech Study Discord, which is that global technical learners community. I've been a part of that.
Good job remembering it was on Discord. I totally would have said Tech Study Slack.
Well, I'm still a little frustrated with Slack about that whole situation. So it's pretty easy to remember that it's Tech Study Discord now. Hit me up on LinkedIn. I accept all connections. My only request is if you actually want to connect and talk with me, click the three little button option and say connect. Don't just follow. It defaults to follow, and that kind of bugs me, but So actually connect. I do tend to accept all connection requests, and I'm more than happy to chat with people there. And, like I said, you can also reach me on Tech Study Discord. I'm active there as well.
Awesome. Well, Jenn, thank you so much for doing this. If you want to raise your bottle and give everybody one more cheers. Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.
Thanks for listening. And that's all.